Okay, thank you. Well, it's a great privilege to me to introduce you to Professor Kate Newey, even if I think that she does not need an introduction. We all know her work in the theatre industry of the 19th century and women, which has been an inspiration to all of us here in Valencia, and groundbreaking, of course. I don't want to take more time from your talk, so I'm just going to go straight away to presentation, but just let me repeat again how glad we are that you're here at this conference. Professor Kate Newey is a historian of 19th century British literature and culture, specializing in teaching and research in theatre history and women's writing. She's published extensively in Frankenstein, Jane Austen, Victorian women playwrights, and Campbell, Australian theatre, Victorian theatre, popular culture, John Ruskin, Victorian pantomime, dance, and so on and so forth. She's been recently working with Professor Jim Davies, whom we also have the pleasure to have here at this conference, in AHRC-funded projects entitled Theatre and Visual Culture in the Non-19th Century. She recently stepped down from the chair of the Standing Conference of the University Drama Department and was a founding member of the British Association for Victorian Studies, BABS, where she served on its executive committee for 3 years. She's also been convener of the BABS conference, and currently she's been granted with the European Research Council Advanced Grant for a project entitled Women's Transnational Theatre Networks 1789-1914, and we've got the pleasure of listening to her work within this project today. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lara, and to say how pleased I am to be here amongst friends. And Lara and Ignacio Ramos-Gay, who is in the audience also, have been very involved in helping me land the big grant, and I hope they're going to be very much involved in the next 5 years. I'm speaking before this particular grant has actually started, and before I've really done any research on it. But I'm amongst friends here, I know, and I think this is one of the most perfect conferences to start talking about what I hope we're going to do in the work. It's a 5-year programme of work funded by the European Research Council, although really, because of the vagaries of the terrible B word, I do have to say that it is actually funded under the United Kingdom Research and Innovation Council's guarantee. If you won the ERC money, they would stump up the funds. This is how Brexit is not saving Britain money. Anyway, so I hope this paper will be a brief introduction to some of the questions and themes that we'll be pursuing in the project over the next 5 years. And I'm going to talk about 3 starting points, the little tufts of thread that I'm hoping to pull out into larger woven sort of fabrics of the work of women transnationally. The project came out of, I have to say, sheer frustration. That I was being asked quite regularly to contribute something on women in theatre to various volumes of 19th century literature, 19th century theatre, 19th century culture, and still have been, even though the book that I did about women's theatre writing in Victorian Britain, that's its title, was published over 15 years ago. I'm still riding on that work, but it seemed to me that there was still more to do if we were still asking these same quite basic questions. Where were the women? So in this new project, I want to tackle some of the historical theorizations that keep positioning women as what Françoise Bache talked about in as long ago as 1974 as relative creatures. And I want to do this by looking at women's international networks, and because of my linguistic limitations, shall we say, my monoglot Britishness, I want to look particularly at those mapping onto the British Empire, although some of the work that Ignacio will be doing will be looking into parallels with the exchanges between Paris and London. So I want to explore how women's agency and innovation made theatrical empire. And this approach is, make this work. There we go. So what I'm looking at is the exchanges between London, Dublin, London, Bombay and Calcutta. I'll be talking about Calcutta today, and Sydney and Melbourne, with a parallel study by a couple of other team members in the sort of London-Paris work. And this approach for me is framed by a model of history that eschews the focus on radical moments of change, but instead is looking for patterns of remediation, exchange, and circulation. The dominant narrative of European theatre history tends to be a teleological model of inevitable progress towards the aesthetically challenging and innovative avant-garde of the late 19th and early 20th century modernism. And we've heard just now how various people are starting to really deeply question and trouble that model. But I think it's still dominant in the textbooks. It's to be found in all the standard histories of British drama, and also is remarkably uniform across standard national theatre histories in the rest of Europe. For example, Marvin Carlson's large body of work on post-revolutionary French theatre, and even the magisterial survey of Erika Fischer-Richter's dramas. She argues that the driving narrative of German theatre is an aesthetic progress from Sturm und Drang theatre of the Romantic period into the development of naturalism through the Bürgerliche theatre of the 19th century, and that bourgeois theatre that she talks about is seen as merely a stepping stone. I think also what you see in these standard narratives is a deep cultural anxiety about the categories of the popular, or what Jane Moody calls the illegitimate theatre on the one hand, and the elite or the legitimate drama on the other. I've just started working with a new Chinese national PhD student who we hope is going to be working on the Agatha Christie as a playwright. And she's been doing a whole lot of reading, and she said to me, "What is this thing called legitimate drama?" And I was trying to explain that very complex industrial, professional, regulatory, but also sort of customary and very snobbish term to someone, completely unaware or unfamiliar with the history. As well as overlooking women, these narratives that we still live with focus on national and public institutions vested with high cultural capital, generally connected with the work of male theatre practitioners, principally playwrights and actor-directors. And this is still the case. It's still the case that the focus is often on building-based theatre directors and playwrights. And part of the kind of frustration, I could think of stronger words, that when I decided, that I wanted to come back to this work, was pre-COVID in 2016, and then 2019. In 2016 in Ireland, there was a centenary season of plays at the Abbey Theatre announced, I think none of which, there was one play by a woman out of the centenary season. And you might have seen it all over Twitter and social media about the awakening of feminists. there was a similar move in New York at the time to get 50-50 by 2020. Similarly, in 2019, the first half of the British National Theatres, or the English National Theatre season, was announced under the new director, Rufus Norris, and there was one play directed by a woman. It was a children's play, not on the main stage. The National Theatre backed off very quickly and said, that's only half the season, we've got better things coming up, but it's still not good enough. And I have generations of young undergraduate women that I teach who look at this and kind of go, I want to be a director, where's the future for me? So this is still, I think, something that we need to be thinking about, and I think it's often located in our focus on building-based and national histories. So, what happens then is that what Claire Cochrane has written about in her wonderful study of 20th century British theatre, where she focuses on the majority experience of the majority of the audience, which is not the elite literary theatre at all. It's the popular, it's the commercial, it's the regional, it's the what you might go and see in the West End as the jukebox musicals. And we academics kind of go, ooh, but it's okay if they're historical. So what I'm trying to theorise in this broader framework is trying to move us away from national theatre histories to look at the commercial, the mainstream, and the non-elite. And what we find in those, I'm going completely off my text here, is a mobility. A mobility in literary travel, but also in form, in genre. The other thing that I'm really thinking about in this project, and I don't know if it's my age or it's the age we live in, but I'm very interested in the way that this teleological model of theatre historiography that I'm trying to unpick is also knitted into, I think, the last grand historical narrative of the Enlightenment, and that is of progress. And that persists despite post-structuralist critiques of Enlightenment belief. And so the dominant historiographic orthodoxy in our literary and theatre histories defines progress as the move from popular mass entertainment that we get, you know, during and after the French Revolution, a real moment, I think, of change, towards the orthodoxy of psychological realism, of naturalism with both a small and an uppercase N. And it's a model of history that has tended to privilege moments of rupture, of change, of revolution. And I think this is part of the reason that women's playwriting particularly, but women's work more generally, has been relegated to the realm of negligible, overlooked, invisible, non-aesthetic theatre. It's generally not the theatre that is making huge revolutionary changes. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I think it's just a different kind of narrative. So I want to think about a woman-centred theatre history in this period from a critical and historical standpoint, which is, to quote Claire Cochrane, not primarily driven by a criteria of artistic innovation or value. It doesn't imply that women weren't theatrical innovators, nor that their work lacked aesthetic value. Rather, it recognises, as I've argued elsewhere, that the criteria for aesthetic value and innovation were overdetermined and entangled with hegemonic ideologies of sex, class, and nation, the big three, which operated to exclude women playwrights from accounts of the national drama, of innovation and aesthetic value. So, theatre is one of the most responsive forms of public communication of the period. I mean, this is a given, but it's worth saying. It embodies ideas of nation, of society, and sex and gender within these highly effective frameworks, and is communicated often spectacularly in the 19th century theatre through live embodied performance practices. And I want to try to capture some of that as a highly mobile form, using the Enlightenment concept of cosmopolitanism and the ideals of that cosmopolitanism, as flawed as they are and as threaded through as they are with ideas of white, racialized superiority. I think there's still something there about the ideas of universality and connection as human desiderata, and these are the frame for the study of the material practices of the theatre industry and its patterns of circulation and mobility in these transnational exchanges of performers, aesthetic movements, translations, adaptations, which have played a significant role in the European theatre and beyond. And I'm heartened by, over the last 10 years, I think, the really interesting move towards thinking beyond the nation in theatre history. The work by Steve Wilmer and his contributors, or Jules Hollidge on Global Ibsen, and that work done in Australia on Global Ibsen, sponsored by foundations in Norway. The work of Eva Partidja in Poland, for example, or Christopher Baum, a New Zealander transplanted to Munich. These are all examples of contemporary scholars that I hope this project is in dialogue with. So, I'm going to start in Calcutta. You'll see how raw the information is. In her wonderful new book, Strolling Players of Empire, the historian Kathleen Wilson argues that the theatre was an important factor in, I quote, British modernity installing itself across the globe. Now, Wilson is a political and social historian, and I've been reading this book to participate in an online round table on its publication over the summer. And as I've been reading it over the summer with my feet in Langstrath Beck in Borrowdale and on trains, and I keep thinking, yes, what took the historians so long to get here? But they have, and Kathleen Wilson's work finishes in 1833. But it's got some very useful insights for my new project. In her discussion of Calcutta as one of the nodes of imperial power that she's tracking, she makes the point several times that the presence of women in Anglo-Indian Calcutta society was seen as a mark of its civilization throughout the 18th century. However, there's much that we still don't know about the work that women did within that society, although Margot Finn is now working on this. But even less do we know about the work that women did in the Anglo-Indian theatre in the city. I've got two tiny threads that are starting points that I want to pull out as ways of investigating the work of women in this Anglo-Indian culture. My first, about whom I don't really as yet have much to say, is Emma Bristow, or Bistow, and the record so far, I think it's Bistow, but the record gives her name as both. So there's even an uncertainty about her name. And she established the Chowringhee Street Theatre. It came out of a theatre built in a private home of a rich Russian emigre, trader, where's his name, Gerasim Lebedev, in late 18th century Calcutta. Bistow was active in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. And at the moment, that's the start of the thread, and I don't have much more about her. But I think it's extraordinary that we don't know more about her. And I'm going to talk at the end of my paper about why I think that is, what are some of the reasons for that? My other starting point for India, I did get it, yes, is Esther Leach. We know a little bit more about her. She managed a theatre, the Sanssouci Theatre in Calcutta, which is no more, although the site is now the site of an Anglican cathedral, or was. And I think that's a fascinating pairing of the profane theatre and the sacred religious space, both European colonisers of Calcutta in the 18th and early 19th century. But Esther Leach was known as the Mrs. Siddons of Calcutta. She was, she sounds like she had just this incredible drive and energy. She got this theatre built, she got productions put on. She was basically an actress manager, and we've been hearing about other actress managers in several papers today. But we know very little about her, although, as you can see, there was a production very recently by a theatre company in Kolkata, as I should now say. And the reviewer in the Telegraph India, as you can see there, the quote there, the collective amnesia about the torchbearers of proscenium theatre practice in Calcutta. And I think that goes to my point here. I think there are two principal reasons for the obscuring of these two women, about whom at the moment I stand before you to say I know very little. Which is that they both worked to establish a theatre in Calcutta, but the theatres were private and amateur. Most Indian theatre histories, most national histories of Indian theatre, when they don't start in 1947 with independence, for very good reasons, when they do look back at early Bengali theatre, they identify 1872 as the time when we get the first public theatre in Kolkata. The first proscenium theatre, this is ignoring all the other forms of performance we have there, but I'm talking about the English, the Anglo-Indian theatre. And so I think that this is not commercial, this is still the playing area of the rich Anglo-Indians, although it's with Esther Leach's management that Indian citizens, Indian natives, although I feel slightly uncomfortable with that word, start to attend the theatre along with the English, the Anglo-Indians. But to call them English is odd because a lot of people spent, as we know, if they worked for the British East India Company, they might have spent their entire lives in Calcutta or Bombay. I think the other reason is precisely that reason of colonisation. Invasion, if you like, although it wasn't quite as brutal as an invasion as the one I'm going to talk about next, is that most theatre histories of India start in 1947, or they might start after the First War of Independence, post what we would call the Indian Mutiny, 1857. And so the theatre historiography of India is quite understandably tied up with the nationalist story about independence from the British Empire. Very good reasons for that. On the other hand, I think that this went on and I want to know about it. And I think that's the privilege of the historian. We can say, this happened, whether or not it was a good thing, it happened and we should know about it. And I'm hoping that what will come out of that is a way of being able to talk about the two histories, if you like, and to look at what the exchanges were. What did Indians bring to this Anglo-Indian theatre? What did Anglo-Indian practitioners maybe take back to London when they went to London? So I'm interested in those mechanisms of exchange, and hopefully in a generous way. Esther Leach herself died an unpleasant theatrical death by fire. Her costume, it's a death in the 1840s that was not unusual for people working in the theatre. And as I say, her work is still obscure, but it's being revived in Kolkata and by Indians rather than English Anglo-Indians. As I say, there's a delicate balance to be struck here about the importation of a theatrical form, but it also starts to position and make us very aware in our theatrical histories of the presence of Kolkata as a major global city. And I hope that that's going to be something to feed back into British theatre history. I know myself from having visited India how much I realised how much of British culture was actually inflected by our long colonisation of India, how much of our language, our understanding, our fabrics in our houses come out of the 200 or 300 years of imperial rule in India. So I'm very interested in that exchange. My next, I'm pressing the wrong button. It's the next slide, but it'll come up in a minute. My next port of call is Sydney. And here we're looking at, the next slide, if I can get it. Right. Thank you. We're looking at a very different kind of colonisation, which I'm going to call invasion. One of the first plays written in and about the British colony of Sydney in New South Wales, it wasn't Australia at that point, turns on a racist patriarchal joke. In Edward Gagan's 1844 comedy, The Currency Lass, or My Native Girl, Sir Samuel Simile, theatre-struck dilettante and uncle of the hero Stanford, travels to Sydney when he hears the news that Stanford is about to marry a native girl. Sir Samuel assumes that native means indigenous, black. And he arrives in Sydney full of typical racist language, ready to dissuade his nephew from miscegenation through marriage. Sir Samuel brings with him 5 tragedies, 4 comedies, 2 operas, a score of melodramas, and farces innumerable, to quote his landing speech. Of course, the comic twist is that Stanford is about to marry Susan Harty, a white woman born in the colony, and that's what the term currency lass means. She's the first generation to be born in the colony in Sydney. Her birthplace makes her the British native girl of New South Wales. Gagan apparently wrote the play for actress Tilly Jones, herself one of the first actors to be born in New South Wales. Susan Harty persuades Samuel Simile that she is good to marry his nephew, or good enough, by a theatrical ruse. She masquerades in several parts. She plays the swashbuckling sailor, Frank Foretop, the French artiste, Mademoiselle Mathilde Angélique Corinne de la Roche-Bergeon, and the touchy and ready-to-duel Charles Clackett, Esquire, to persuade Samuel Simile that his nephew's betrothed wife has outstanding histrionic abilities, because he had said he would only let his nephew and heir marry a woman with these histrionic abilities. The play offers an intriguing starting point to start to unpick the role of women in the transnational patterns of exchange and mediation that I'm looking at. While the play is resolutely nationalistic, and it's interesting, it's 1844, it's only 70 years after the colony, or the invasion happened. It's resolutely nationalistic. It establishes what became known as the radical nationalist movement in Australia, which is pretty much typified mainly by Sworn for the English, the POMs, as those of us who migrated there were called. But it's still quite evident today, especially around international cricket and rugby matches. There's also the acknowledgement of the necessity for the global mobility for the new colony. So this movement between, you know, Sir Samuel Simile seems to zip out to Sydney. It was a long and arduous journey, but there's something there about the mobility written into this play already. Together with Susan Harty's brother, Harry Harty, and the hero, the emigrant Englishman, sorry, I'm mixing myself up here, sorry, I'll start that again. The other characters there, including the hero, Stanford, who is an English gentleman, transposed, not transported, but the uncle, Sir Samuel, emigrant Englishman. There are Susan and her brother, Harry Harty, who's a sailor traveller, but also a native lad. There's also the inevitable Irish servant, Lanty, and the songs which frequently stop the action. It was known as a ballad opera. Are all well-known Irish or English folk tunes with new lyrics. So it's a bricolage of the old and the new worlds. But at its centre, the currency lass turns on the sparkling and knowing performances of the actresses playing Susan, or the actress playing Susan. And as yet, I don't have many records of Tilly Jones, the actress. Gagan's other well-known comedy, we do know something about the actress playing in it. His other comedy, True Love, or The Interlude Interrupted, is similarly plotted around theatre as its subject, and I think this meta-theatricality is really important. And it similarly focuses on the female characters as drivers of the action and the triumphant winners in these comic plots. The play revolves around Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown is a self-made and self-important man who sees the theatre as a waste of time and actors as lazy idlers. He's called away from Sydney on business. While he's gone, his wife is asked to step in at the last moment to perform at the theatre in a new interlude called True Love. This is in a play already called True Love. To be performed that night at the Royal Victoria Theatre, the play in which this play is being performed. So you can see it's this Chinese box. The Royal Victoria Theatre was the first permanent theatre built in Austria. So Mrs. Brown accepts, thinking her husband will be away and he won't know. He returns unexpectedly, and hearing that his wife is at the theatre, thinks she's in the audience. He doesn't realise she's on the stage. He comes into the theatre late, noisily, sees his wife on the stage, apparently embracing a strange man, runs from the audience up onto the stage and tries to separate them out, and is punched in the nose for his troubles. I worked on this with my students when I was working in Sydney, and it's really great fun, this theatre within the theatre. And what that does is it positions the audience in the position of superior knowledge and indeed civilization. They can tell the difference between theatre and life. Mr. Brown can't. The audience is automatically superior and civilized and knowledgeable and cosmopolitan. The gags don't stop there, and the play is full of these topical references. So in the opening scene, Mr. Brown is reading the Sydney Morning Herald with a review of the play in which he is actually performing. It's mind-bending. You've also got the public knowledge that the actress, Elizabeth Stanley, playing Mrs. Brown, is a good friend in real life of various other people in the play who are seen as Mrs. Brown's friends. So there's this all the time, this playing with the knowledge of extra-theatrical, the off-stage world of these actors transformed into an on-stage silly farce, really. But I think that this is really fascinating in its playing out of theatrical knowledge in the audience in Sydney, a new colony in a country that was invaded less than 70 years ago. The sense, again, as Kathleen Wilson argues about theatre in Calcutta, indicating a level of civilization, I think that we find that, you know, multiplied in these early comedies in Sydney. So the work of Eliza Winstanley is another of the thread ends that I'm pulling on. She was an actress and a writer who worked in Sydney at Barnett Levy's Royal Victoria Theatre, and as True Love shows, she was a well-known favourite of the Sydney audience. She was originally British. She worked in Australia only for about 10 years. In the late 1840s, she returned to London and becomes a featured performer, second only to Ellen Tree, in Charles Keane's company at the Princesses. So she goes back from Australia right into the middle of this new movement for the bourgeois, respectable theatre audience of London, slap bang, and as Rowan McWilliam has pointed out, the Princesses Theatre was slap bang in the middle of Oxford Street, the commercial centre of London. In the 1850s, she started to turn to writing as well. She writes this fascinating, sort of not quite romana play. It's much more a kind of a story. It's a story about travelling players and the difficulties of working in the theatre, shifting scenes in theatrical life. She also writes many short stories for magazines, largely directed at a female readership over this period from the 1850s. But she returns to Australia and in the 1880s lives there as a retired woman and dies there in 1882. And I think, again, what's really interesting is this pattern of extensive travel. It was not unusual to make these trips, and indeed the Keanes travelled out to Australia. Again, a journey and a kind of production that was largely managed by Keane's wife and his niece. And it's mostly their letters we have that record their journey to and their travels around Australia. Neither True Love nor Currency Lass is written by a woman. Gagin was a convict in Sydney because of his tendency to fraud, and he's let out on licence because of his connection with the theatre, commits fraud again, and is put straight back into penitentiary in Sydney. But I think both plays focus on the presence and work of women in the colony just a bare 70 years, barely 2 generations after invasion in 1788. The fame of Eliza Winstanley in the Sydney Theatre is a different version, I think, of the white woman's burden in empire as an indicator of an index of civilization, so-called. Winstanley's professional identity also raises questions about national identity in the same way that the work of May Holt might well do later in the century. And I've written about May Holt as, is she an Australian playwright or is she not? She worked in Australia, she was connected with an Australian transplanted northern theatre manager, George Coppin. She's connected with his family company. Richard Fotheringham, an Australian theatre historian, has countered that and argues that Holt really only spent about 10 years of her working life in Australia and most of her career in London. But I think there's a remnant of that migrant experience in both of their work, and I want to explore the impact of that for many of the women theatre practitioners that we start to see have made these extended journeys in the course of their work. One of Eliza Winstanley's well-known parts in Sydney had been the lead role in Mrs. Samuel Carter Hall's play of Irish life, Mabel's Curse. Winstanley's success in Mabel's Curse gives us a neat coincidental, I'm not saying it's causality, but it's definitely a beautiful coincidence, a coincidental link to the third of 4 case studies of this project. So I move us to Ireland. to think a little bit about Anna Maria Hall. Mabel's Curse was a melodrama adapted from a short story written by Anna Maria Hall. Hall was born in Ireland as Anna Maria Fielding, and I actually have got some pictures of her. Yes, there we are. So a beautiful picture here by Daniel Cleese, a working picture from, the frontispiece of one of her plays. The middle picture is Anna Maria and Samuel Carter Hall, looking very Victorian. She was born and raised in Wexford in Ireland and moved with her mother to London at the age of 15. And again, it's a little like Eliza Winstanley or May Holt, spending some small part of their life in one place, major part of their life in another, but the two informing each other. Because much of the work of Anna Maria Hall, as a lady of letters, drew on her Irish background, although, as Cara Maloney comments, in one of the rare, in fact, I think the only book really about the scholarship of Irish women playwrights pre the 1950s, and she comments, like much 19th century Irish writing, even Hall's most Irish-focused work was published or produced in London and designed to cater to English tastes. And this blurring between what is Irish and what is English is something I'm increasingly fascinated by. I wrote a little about Anna Maria Hall in the book I did 15 years ago, and indeed several other women playwrights who worked in London. And, I have been not quite humiliated, but certainly embarrassed to learn that quite a few of them are Irish by birth. And the imperialising of the English language allows us just to claim those as English playwrights. They wrote in English. Anna Maria married journalist and editor Samuel Carter Hall, who edited the Art Journal, amongst other things, and was by all accounts a terrible snob. He is reputedly the model for Pecksniff in Martin Chuzzlewit, which gives you an idea about what he was like. But through her work and her marriage and the way that those two intertwined, Hall was at the centre of literary and artistic London, the kind of middle brow literary and artistic London. And Sarah Hale, writing about Anna Maria Hall in Woman's Record, or Sketches of Distinguished Women, notes that she's also involved in good works. Her name was on the committee for the asylum of the Governess's Benevolent Institution, and she was involved in the establishment of the Queen's College in London for female education. She edited the journals The Juvenile, Forget Me Not, and Sharp's London magazine. She was to have edited John Maxwell's St James's magazine, but what Hall calls the connection between the Halls and Maxwell ceased in 1863. Now again, I have a coincidence here that I don't know is as a causal relationship. But 1863, as many people in this audience will know, is the moment when Lady Audley's Secret bounces on or explodes across the London theatre. And the open secret of Mary Braddon living with John Maxwell without marriage becomes a very piece of public knowledge. And I just wonder about that coincidence. The Halls worked from the metropolitan centre of the British Empire, London, so it's easy to overlook the colonial relationship between Ireland and Britain at the time. Well, it's easy if you're English. Not if you're Irish, I imagine. There's a shared language and culture, but both of these are evidence of national conflict and domination going back centuries. Anna Maria Hall's work ranged across a variety of genres as a working professional writer, and she might be considered in the same way that Stuart Curran describes Letitia Landon as a cosmopolitan writer. And indeed, Hall knew Letitia Landon. Samuel Carter Hall goes on about all the famous writers that used to visit them, and Landon was one of them. Clearly, Hall was engaged in selling to whatever market would take her work. So, for example, in 1837, she published Finden's Tableaus, a series of 13 scenes of national culture, beauty and costume. It's an 1830s version of the coffee table book, and it's full of beautiful engravings and matching texts, which she wrote, and she wrote a series of short stories set in various countries, such as for Naples she wrote The Romance of Madalena. For Switzerland she wrote a story called Poor Josephine. For Spain she wrote a story, The Jilt's Reward, and these were stories matched with beautiful engraved texts. Mary Lawson Mitford, another of the Hall's friends, took over the editing come authorship of subsequent editions of these Finden's albums, and they were known as Books of Beauties, and they constituted, I think, a significant part of the high-value publishing aimed primarily at a female readership in the period. Hall's short stories and articles were published in a number of middle-brow journals in the middle of the 19th century and draw on her Irishness and often exploit an interest in Irish folk stories and legends, and we know about that kind of, you know, the stereotypical Irish character in the theatre in this period. So that's the background to Mabel's Curse, which is adapted from Hall's own short story, Mabel O'Neill's Curse, which was published in her book Sketches of Irish Character, which I was looking up to try and find a picture. I don't know if I've got one more slide. I was trying to find a picture of it. I don't think I have. No, that's it. I couldn't find a picture, and the only thing I found was on eBay. So if you're interested, you can buy that for £95. She also wrote a very popular comedy, The Groves of Blarney, and that was adopted from one of the main stories in her collections, Lights and Shadows of Irish Life, which played to excellent reviews in the Adelphi Theatre in 1833. And reviews of Hall's work generally were always good, but always tended to focus on her sex, that she's a woman, and her Irishness. In all the accounts of these national theatre traditions emerging from the imported or colonising social practices of the British Empire, in theatre as in other activities and structures, the emphasis so far has primarily been on nationalist theatre writing, and the historiographies focusing on movements for national independence in the theatre. So it's theatre as nation building, and it's an important function for theatre. But I hope I've shown in these brief three starting to pull the threads that one of the things I want to do is complicate those national historiographies. And this linking of historiography with national independence is particularly striking, I think, in Indian and Australian theatre historiography. And as I say, it's understandable in India that the idea of a National Theatre of India starts with the final achievement of independence in 1947. The First War of Independence, the Indian Uprising of 1857, actually resulted in the putting down of that mutiny, rebellion. I don't like to call it a mutiny really, actually imposed strong legal and practical sanctions against any kind of independent Indian culture. And it's a moment, it's a hugely problematic moment. Even the Anglo-Indian segment of the Indian population was censored and sanctioned in terms of what could be published and what could be performed. It moved completely away after 1857. Regulation of India moved obviously from the East India Company to the British government, and cultural regulation moved completely away from earlier Orientalist policies of the British East India Company, particularly under Warren Hastings, who argued for an Orientalist rule of India. It was still a rule of India, and his version of it was British sovereignty exercised in Indian ways, and this was completely stamped out after 1857. So it's not, it's completely reasonable that Indian national theatre history started in 1947. And I'm not critical of this, but I'm interested in what is discussed and written about and what is passed over or ignored. I'm not sure that it's always a coincidence that work by women in the commercial theatre does not feature in these national theatre historiographies, in the same way that commercial theatrical enterprises generally tend to be overlooked more generally in nationalist theatre historiographies. But the double whammy for women is that most of their work in the 19th century, as I've shown in my previous work, was in the commercial or mainstream theatre. So there's this sort of double occlusion. In Dublin, Sydney and Melbourne, these movements coalesced around around the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And the connections between Dublin and Australia, Sydney and Melbourne, are fascinating. Australian playwrights such as Newey, based in Melbourne, looked to the Irish nationalist playwrights such as Yeats, Synge and O'Casey as models of representation for the unique experience of living in Australia. Models of theatrical representation. Famously, when Louis Essen visited Yeats in Ireland, Yeats advised them in a wonderfully ironic stereotyping of the nature of Australian national character. Oh, you should write about lonely shepherds in their huts. You know, this was the idea of Australia from an Irish nationalist. I think there's a wonderful double irony there. Essen's play Dead Timber did just this. But his comedy about denying the vote for women, The Time Is Not Yet Ripe, it's an anti-suffrage play, is probably more representative of his work and of the mainstream of Australian theatre. Once again, like the earliest plays written in Australia, such as The Currency Lass, the plot revolves around the position of women in the colonies and their slightly out-of-placeness in the colonies. The currency lass, the native girl, should she be there? The time is not yet right for women to have the vote. You know, I mean, the question of the white man's burden, the question of the white woman's burden in the British Empire becomes quite a pressing one, I think, through these theatrical and dramatic representations. So in Australia, what was known as the radical nationalist theatre writing of the modernist and post-World War II movements in Australian theatre is mirrored in a radical nationalist historiography that identifies the key milestones in that history as being the separation of Australian theatre from its British parent. Like all stories of adolescent separation from the parent, it's one in which the younger culture defines itself and is defined through structures of opposition and conflict and deliberate contradiction, deliberate rejection, leading to, you know, necessary separation and independence. And here I'm going to riff a little bit on something I don't quite believe in, but I think it's pertinent. Harold Bloom wrote of the Oedipal complex as a mechanism in literary history in his work on the anxiety of influence, and his explanation of the mechanisms of change in art and literature is that Oedipal, the son, must kill the father in order to become fully the grown man. If we track the popular theatre, the theatre within which most women worked and which most audiences saw, I think there's a different model. And I'm playing with this idea, and it's not one I'm necessarily wedded to. I think there might be a maternal model. If Freud and subsequent psychoanalytic orthodoxy suggest that male artists have to go through a kind of Oedipal conflict in rejecting influence, in killing their literary fathers, then what do women artists do once they've killed the angel in the house, as Virginia Woolf recommends? Now, the angel in the house is not someone other, it is the internalized, proper woman, proper lady that Virginia Woolf, within the woman writer herself, that Virginia Woolf says you have to kill within yourself before you can be a fully fledged artist. Australian writer, academic and diplomat Jill Kerr-Conway suggests in her memoir, The Road to Karain, which is a wonderful piece about, again, moving between the outback of Queensland and I think she was the president of Smith College at one point in New England, in the United States. He suggests in her memoir, The Road to Karain, that we lack a cultural story about the separation of daughters from their mothers. She says, men have the Oedipus story, and that is seen as one of the foundations of European literature. Daughters don't kill their mothers in that classic Oedipal structure. As Oscar Wilde quipped in one of his plays, women become their mothers, and that is their tragedy. I don't want to delve too deeply into psychoanalytic theory as a framework. I'm not qualified to do so. But what I'm suggesting here is that we might find significance and a different set of cultural patterns if we use this as a metaphor of how daughters become their mothers rather than kill them. And maybe what we need to look at are the ways that women's stories and women's work are circulated, exchanged, adapted, and remediated. That women's creative work is the work of becoming rather than killing off and doing something new. And I want to credit Caroline Radcliffe, who we're going to hear straight after me, thank goodness, for drawing our attention some years ago to the power of remediation in the 19th century theatre. It's a terrifically and powerful idea that she has shown us how we need to apply it to the theatre. So, thinking back through our mothers, as Virginia Woolf also recommended, I'm increasingly wanting to argue that in order to represent the nature of the work done by most women in the theatre, and actually also most men, we need to think of integrative and associative models of practice and history. Although there's a great pleasure in being able to point to a particular woman practitioner as the first, or the most successful, or the most original, and I've done that myself, the way that women make theatre and make theatrical empire, it seems to me, is actually through iterative and collaborative practices, and through their own or others' mediation of women's stories. And these are career-long repetitions and workings of these stories that make this theatrical empire for us. So thank you for listening. And yes, in a very troubling way, the play turns on a racist assumption. But I don't think that should stop us talking about it. Yeah. And inevitably, there'll be, of necessity, a discussion about, certainly the invasive and colonizing processes. I'm interested also, though, in thinking about that exchange. And as a British person, if you travel in India, you see how much we have absorbed of Indian practices and cultures into British culture. I think, you know, so I'm interested in a notion of exchange, principally, yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I was really interested in what you just reiterated at the end about your methodology. You don't want to do the first or the most successful or the most well-known. But it sort of left me with a methodological question of how do you find the average of the average? And are you sort of always leaning into that problem that the things we have the most archival records for are those which were distinctive in some way, shape or form? Yeah. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how you selected the case studies.
These are really just starting points. They're not necessarily... well, the national case studies are, in a sense, very broad. And the whole idea of one of these really big funded projects is that... I'm going to talk some... the EU people amongst me will know about the kind of ERC language, which requires high risk and high gain. And I think the high risk is partly the looking for the unexceptional, because yes, they don't necessarily leave traces. But I was thinking when Margrethe was giving her paper about the way that you were talking about the necessity of using different kinds of research methodologies, looking at things like letters and diaries, finding around the edges. There might be a blank in the middle, but you can find things around the edges. But you know, the example of Emma Bristow, I'm pretty sure she's Bristow, is a case in point. You know, there's even an uncertainty in the record, such as we have, of how you spell her last name. So yeah, there is always, and I kind of say that at the end there to remind myself not to just seek the high points, but to look at the ordinary working practices of theatre professionals, building on the kind of work that Janice Norwood has been doing with actresses. And obviously, actresses is a very useful place to start because we have more records of those. But I think with writers and thinking beyond not just their writing for the theatre, but the kind of way that they're working across genres as well as across spaces is another way to kind of pick up what is the unexceptional in this world. And I think that I'm standing on the shoulders of a number of researchers who've been doing that kind of work already.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's great to see València again 10 years later. And congratulations on your new project as well.
Well, thank you.
And actually, I was wondering on your project as well, on your connection between France and the UK. And I was wondering if I was thinking of all these French actresses, Mademoiselle Lejazy, Sarah Bernard, which were most important in our Keynote, but they were obviously very influential in terms of how they inspired British actresses not to become performers and actresses. But I was wondering if there was any kind of influence as well, to become theatre entrepreneurs. I mean, did they inspire British actresses not to become independent as far as the theatre industry is concerned? I was thinking of Sarah Bernard when she decided to quit, to reject the Comédie Française, to become an independent performer herself, something which was considered to be some kind of attack on international theatre, both in Britain and in France. So did they inspire, to become theatre entrepreneurs? If not major actresses, I'm thinking about minor figures of the theatre in Britain, and do you think this kind of influence reached India too?
Those are wonderful questions that I hope we'll find the answers to. I suppose, again, one builds on work, starting points that have already been done. And I'm not sure about the influence, as you say. I think that we know about the influence of the great French stars and John Stokes has written beautifully about that. might not necessarily, there might not necessarily be that direct influence. I'm thinking of, for example, Julie Bush-Bailey's work on Miss Kelly. We saw earlier this morning, we saw, we had a mention of Miss Kelly's theatre. I'm wondering whether actually we get, but I think we do get the model of the great independent entrepreneurial star, Rochelle and Sarah Bernhardt particularly. Give us Ellen Terry, perhaps. You know, I think there's something going on there. And that's a question for you, Ignacio. Ignacio is one of the kind of doing some work within the project. When I asked him, he said yes, which was very kind of him, because I'm a monoglot Brit and don't have the languages really. But I'm also interested, talking to my colleague Eva Partijo in Poland, where she's also working on the Polish mainstream theatre, and she says, well, the women were working in the commercial popular theatre. They weren't necessarily the big innovators. And somehow I think we have to get over our embarrassment at saying women weren't necessarily the innovators. We still think innovation in anything is necessarily better than other stuff. Yes, on the other hand, most of our cultural consumption now and then is in the ordinary and the recycled and the remediated and the adapted. There's a great pleasure in that as well. But I think that I've got some students starting some research projects, and one group wants to work on Sarah Bernhardt, indeed as an entrepreneur, not necessarily as a great actress, but the way that she organised her costumes and she wrote things, and they said, was she a director? I said, we wouldn't probably use that word, but she was a director, you know. So it's still inspiring. Thank you. I'm random.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Thanks, Kate. That's really interesting, and obviously it overlaps with a lot of work I've been doing on transnational actresses, specifically Sarah Bernhardt and Rajan and Miss Tanya. So I've just finished a book on that. But what interests me is, and what I really like about what you're doing, which I'm excited about, is the way you seem to be talking about careerographies, yeah? So we're really looking historiographically across the extent of a career. We're not obviously highlighting certain points. The interesting bit for me is also that you're going to Australia and going back. So I'd like to know about what happens when someone goes back, you know, in terms of a two-way street, so it's not so linear. And also, I think it's really, really great that you're looking at India, because I just think there's such an absence so far in terms of circulations of theatre cultures. And I think I've done a lot of work on triangulating through America, England and Paris, but that's so almost, you can find surprising things, but it's going to be a lot more surprising, I think, what you can find. And even just the title of that theatre, Sans Souci, why would it have that title? Like, there's so many questions, and I just think, your talk's kind of raised a lot, and I'm excited, and I just wanted to say,
thanks.
Really great.
Thanks, Victoria. I think, yes, and obviously some of the Indian material is really very unknown, and we have, there are some scholars already working on some of it. Catherine Hanson's work, Rachel Nicholson has done an important book on Parsi theatre in Bombay. I think that British and maybe American scholars have treated the Indian material for precisely the reasons that I think are behind Karan's question about difficult material. There's a difficult history there, but I kind of think that it doesn't help to sort of hiding away. And these things happened, and one has to accept that they happened, but we need to know about them. And we do know that, I mean, from Christopher Barnes' work later in the century with his work on Bandman, that India was a big part of the kind of what we might now call the Commonwealth touring circuit. I'm very aware in this project that America is the big absence. There's a lot of evidence where you would know if you use the Cobbin collection in the State Library of Victoria, where there's this wonderful letter that George Coppin, or it might have been Bland Holt, I can't remember now, it's a long time since I'm going back to that material, where he says, he's writing to an agent in San Francisco, and the connection in the middle of the 19th century is between the gold rush in San Francisco and the gold rush in Victoria in Australia. And so there's a theatre network there because of the commerce, you know. Coppin writes from Melbourne saying, "Who is this J.C. Williamson? I've never heard of him." Now, if you've lived any time in Australia, and particularly if you know, if you worked in theatre and the theatre history of the period, J.C. Williamson was the kind of big villain of the first half of the 20th century of Australian theatre, because he was the Andrew Lloyd Webber that my brother who works with people like this says, he calls it the McDonald's theatre of the world. That you just put, or Disney, you know, you put Lion King in there and you put Lion King in there, they don't change. J.C. Williamson started to do that in Australia, but the joy, and apparently, you know, killed, not indigenous, that's the wrong word, killed Australian theatre until after the Second World War. Veronica Kelly is starting to unpick that narrative. But what's really interesting about this letter at the end of the 19th, or the beginning of the 20th century, is there's an Australian entrepreneur kind of going, who is this person, who then becomes the really big entrepreneur. So I think that American connection, there's only so much you can do, even with loads of euro. And, well, it's British money, actually, it's all right, you pays. With loads of research money. But yeah, I think the Indian stuff, we know that India was and you can see from the map I showed at the very beginning, we know that India was a stopping point for touring companies. South Africa is another one, so you can kind of do the tour of all the white racist colonies. But I think the case of India is quite a different, you know, if Australia was invaded, India was invaded or colonised in a very different way, and there's a lot more space there for exchange. I think there to find what that is. You know, the Charingi Street Theatre and indeed the Sanssouci Theatre were both attended by, as it were, middle class and very wealthy Indians. So the great Indian national poet Tagore, his grandfather went to those theatres. They did English translations of Indian texts and translations into Hindu and Sanskrit of British theatre texts. So there's an exchange there. And what I want to know is, what were the women doing in that? How were they working in? And perhaps that goes back to Rachel's question. The women were often the glue, the kind of the oil between the big people, you know. Esther Leach, I think, was one of those mediators. Sorry, I should stop.
Well, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you so much for such a fantastic talk. We've taken some time, most of the time for the break, but I think that we can have a proper break after the 2 long sessions. So we can come back perhaps at 6:30, and we can take some time from the last part of the break just before the final reception. My So, yes, please join me with a round of applause again, and I'll see you.